Mom, just sign here. We'll handle everything. That's what my daughter said, sliding the paper across the kitchen table like it was nothing more than a grocery list, like it didn't carry the weight of 42 years of marriage, like it didn't hold every dollar my husband and I had ever saved, every decision we had ever made together, every promise we had ever whispered late at night when the world felt uncertain and we only had each other to rely on. And I remember the exact way her finger tapped the bottom corner of the page twice. Impatient but controlled, as if she had already decided this was just a formality, as if my role in all of this had already been reduced to a signature, a quiet nod, a simple yes, and for a moment I almost gave it to her. I really did. Because grief does something strange to your mind. It slows you down, makes everything feel distant, like you're watching your own life through a window you can't quite open, and just 2 weeks earlier I had been standing at a cemetery in Alabama, watching them lower my husband into the ground, the man who had handled everything for most of our lives, the man who used to sit at that very same kitchen table with his reading glasses low on his nose, reviewing documents line by line, always careful, always thorough, always telling me, Maggie, never sign anything you don't fully understand, and I used to laugh and tell him he worried too much, that things would always be fine, because we had each other, because we had built something solid, something real, something that couldn't just disappear overnight. But now he was gone, and suddenly everything felt fragile, uncertain, like the ground beneath me wasn't as steady as I had believed for decades. And that's when Emily showed up more often, my daughter. My only child, bringing casseroles, offering to help with the bills, the accounts, the complicated stuff, as she called it, always with that same reassuring tone, always with that same quiet confidence. And at first I was grateful. I truly was, because that's what mothers do. We trust, we believe, we assume our children are extensions of the love we gave them. But then little things started to feel off. Not wrong exactly, just different. Like the way she stopped explaining things in detail, like the way conversations turned into instructions, like the way she would say, "Don't worry about it," before I even had the chance to ask a question. And sitting there at that table, with the pen in my hand and that paper in front of me, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not fear exactly, but a hesitation that didn't belong to grief, something quieter, sharper, like a voice I hadn't listened to in years, finally deciding to speak up. And I looked down at the page, at the dense lines of legal language that blurred together the longer I stared, and then I saw my husband's name printed near the top, and something inside me stopped, completely. Because in that moment it didn't feel like paperwork anymore. It felt like a line I wasn't supposed to cross, not without understanding, not without knowing exactly what I was giving away. And I heard Emily's voice again, softer this time but still firm. "Mom, it's just paperwork, we'll handle everything." And I realized right then that if I signed that page, I wouldn't just be handing over responsibility, I would be handing over control. And once that was gone, I wasn't sure I would ever get it back. And that was the moment I didn't sign, the moment everything changed, even if she didn't know it yet. I set the pen down gently and slid the paper back toward her, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to create space between me and that signature line. And I said, "I think I need a little more time to look this over." Keeping my voice steady even though my hands were not, and for a second something flickered across Emily's face, something quick and sharp that she covered just as quickly with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she leaned back in her chair like she was giving me permission instead of waiting for it, saying, "Of course, Mom, take your time, but we really should get this handled soon. There are deadlines," and that word lingered with me, deadlines, plural, as if there were things already in motion that I had not been told about. And I nodded like I understood, like I agreed, like I was still the same woman she thought I was, the one who would eventually sign whatever was placed in front of her as long as it came from someone she trusted. And then I stood up slowly, taking the folder with me as if it belonged to me, which it did, even if it did not feel like it in that moment. And I walked down the hallway to the bedroom I had shared with my husband for over 4 decades, closing the door behind me in a way that felt final, quieter than any argument could have been. And I sat on the edge of the bed with that folder in my lap, staring at it like it might explain itself if I just waited long enough. But it did not. So instead, I opened the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out his old reading glasses. The ones he refused to replace even after the prescription was no longer quite right, and I put them on. Not because they helped me see better, but because they helped me think like he used to, careful, patient, unwilling to rush through anything that mattered. And I started reading line by line, word by word, slower than I ever had before, and it did not take long before I realized this was not just paperwork, not even close, because buried in those paragraphs was language about transferring decision-making authority, about consolidating accounts, about appointing someone else to act on my behalf in financial matters, and I felt something cold settle in my chest as the meaning became clear, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a puzzle I had never agreed to solve, and I closed the folder halfway through, not because I had finished, but because I had seen enough to know I could not pretend anymore, and from the kitchen I could hear Emily moving around, opening cabinets, running water, making herself at home in a way that suddenly felt different than it had just days before, more certain, more permanent, and I realized then that she thought this was already decided, that whatever this was, it had moved beyond a conversation and into a plan. And I had been placed at the very end of it, expected to approve it without question, and I sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet sounds of my own house, feeling something shift inside me that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with clarity, and without saying a word to her, without asking permission, without explaining what I had seen, I reached for my phone on the nightstand and scrolled through contacts I had not used in years until I found a name that felt like the only steady thing left in that moment, and I pressed call, holding the phone to my ear as it rang, once, twice, 3 times, before a familiar voice answered, calm and measured, and I said, "Robert, it is Margaret Collins. I need you to look at something before I sign anything," and in that moment, before anyone else realized it, before a single account was touched or a single document was finalized, I had already begun to handle it myself. I did not go to Robert's office that same day. I waited until the next morning because I needed one night to think clearly without anyone watching me, without Emily asking questions I was not ready to answer, and that night I barely slept. Not because I was confused anymore, but because everything was starting to make sense in a way that made my stomach feel tight, like pieces of a conversation I had not realized I was part of were finally lining up, and I kept hearing my husband's voice in my head, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, reminding me of the way he used to sit across from me at this very table and say, "We worked too hard for this to let anyone rush us," and I realized I had been letting myself be rushed, gently, politely, but still rushed, and by morning that feeling had turned into something else, something calmer, something closer to resolve, and I got dressed without telling Emily where I was going, choosing a simple blouse and the same shoes I had worn to the bank for years, because I wanted to feel like myself again, not like someone who needed help understanding her own life, and when I walked into Robert Hale's office, it felt familiar in a way I had not expected, the same polished desk, the same quiet shelves lined with files, the same measured way he stood up to greet me, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply gestured for me to sit and said, "Show me what you have," and I placed the folder in front of him without explaining anything, because I wanted to see his reaction before I said a word, and he opened it slowly, reading in silence for several minutes that felt longer than they should have. His expression shifting just slightly as he moved through the pages, not shocked, not alarmed, just attentive in a way that made my chest tighten, and when he finally looked up at me, he did not soften his words or try to ease me into anything. He simply said, "Margaret, if you had signed this, you would have transferred full financial authority over your primary accounts and assets," and he paused just long enough for that to settle before continuing, "This is not routine paperwork. This is control," and I felt my hands go cold in my lap, not because I did not understand, but because I understood completely, and I asked the only question that mattered, keeping my voice as steady as I could she have done anything without my signature? And he shook his head once, firm, certain, not legally, not without your consent, and that word, consent, stayed with me longer than anything else he said, because it meant I had not lost anything yet. It meant there was still a line that had not been crossed, and more importantly, it meant I still had a choice, and Robert leaned back slightly, folding his hands together in a way that told me he was already thinking ahead, already considering options I had not even begun to imagine, and he said, "The question is not what this document does, Margaret. The question is why it was presented to you this way," and I did not answer him right away, because I already knew. I had known the moment I read those lines alone in my bedroom. I had just not wanted to say it out loud, and instead I looked down at the folder again, at the neat lines of text that had been handed to me with a smile and a promise that everything would be taken care of, and I realized that was exactly the problem. They had planned to take care of everything, including me, and I lifted my head and met his eyes, and for the first time since the funeral, my voice did not shake. When I spoke, "I am not signing anything," and he nodded once, not surprised, just ready, and that was the moment I stopped reacting and started thinking about what I would do next. I did not rush out of Robert's office after that. I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around me as if I needed it to confirm what I had just heard, and he did not interrupt that silence. He simply waited, the way my husband used to when he knew I was working through something important, and after a few seconds he reached for a legal pad and turned it toward himself, his pen already moving as if the next steps were not a question but a sequence, and he said, "If you want to protect yourself, we need to move before anything else is presented to you," and I nodded slowly, not because I understood every legal detail, but because I understood the urgency beneath his words. And he began outlining what that meant in practical terms, not dramatic, not complicated, just clear, one decision at a time, reviewing every account, confirming ownership, checking beneficiary designations, and most importantly, ensuring that no one else could step in and act on my behalf without my explicit permission. And as he spoke, I realized how much of our life had been built on quiet structure, on documents and signatures that we had taken seriously for years, and how quickly that structure could shift if I allowed someone else to take control of it, even under the guise of helping. And I felt something inside me settle into place, not anger, not yet, but a kind of clarity that made everything else fade into the background. And I said, "Tell me what I need to do first." And he did not hesitate. He handed me a different set of documents, ones that did not take anything away but instead reinforced what was already mine, updating authority, reaffirming ownership, placing safeguards where there had been assumptions before. And I read each page carefully, slower than I ever had, asking questions when I did not understand something, not because I doubted him, but because I had learned exactly what happened when I did not, and he answered every question without rushing me, without simplifying things in a way that felt dismissive, and for the first time since my husband passed, I felt like I was standing on solid ground again, even if it was different from before, and when I signed those papers, it did not feel like giving something away. It felt like holding on to something that mattered, something I had spent decades building, and when we finished, Robert closed the folder and looked at me directly, his voice calm but firm as he said, "From this point forward, nothing changes unless you decide it does," and that sentence stayed with me as I stood up to leave, because it was simple and absolute in a way I needed, and when I stepped outside into the late morning light, the air felt different, sharper, clearer. And I took a slow breath before getting into my car, knowing that when I went back home, Emily would still be there, still waiting, still expecting me to follow the path she had already planned, and for the first time, I was not thinking about how to explain myself to her. I was thinking about what I would let her believe, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. I did not need to confront her yet. I did not need to argue or accuse or prove anything. All I needed to do was continue exactly as she expected, at least for a little while longer, and when I pulled into my driveway and saw her car still parked there, I felt that same quiet resolve settle in again, steady and controlled. And I walked inside with a folder in my hand, placing it on the kitchen counter as if nothing had changed, as if I had simply gone out for an errand, and when she looked up at me and asked, "Did you get a chance to look everything over?" I met her eyes and gave her a small, calm smile. the kind she had seen 1,000 times before, and I said, I am still going through it, knowing that by the time she realized what I had already handled, it would be far too late for anything to be taken from me. Over the next few days, I did exactly what Emily expected me to do, and nothing more. I moved slowly. I asked simple questions. I reread the same pages in front of her as if I were still trying to understand them, and every time she answered me, her tone carried that same quiet impatience, the kind that hides behind concern, the kind that sounds helpful but feels like pressure. And I noticed how she started choosing her words more carefully, simplifying explanations even further, repeating phrases like, it is routine, and everyone does this, as if repetition alone could make something true, and I nodded when she spoke. I thanked her for helping. I even let her walk me through sections I had already reviewed with Robert, because the more she believed I did not fully understand, the more comfortable she became, and comfort makes people careless in ways they do not notice right away. And that was when I started seeing the pattern more clearly, not just in the documents, but in her behavior, the way she would check her phone after I asked a question, the way she would glance at the signature line before looking back at me, the way she would say, we should really finalize this soon, every single day, as if time itself was part of the plan, and I began to realize that this was never about helping me manage anything. It was about moving me through a process quickly enough that I would not stop to question it, and once I saw that, I could not unsee it, and instead of confronting her, I leaned into it. I let her think she was guiding me. Because in reality, I was the one deciding how far this would go, and each morning, after she left or stepped out for errands, I made my own calls, quiet ones, controlled ones, confirming changes Robert had already set in motion, verifying account access, reviewing statements, making sure every piece of what my husband and I had built was still exactly where it belonged, under my name, under my authority, untouched and protected, and every time I hung up the phone, I felt a little steadier, a little more certain that I was no longer reacting to anything, I was ahead of it. And one afternoon, while Emily was sitting across from me again with that same folder open between us, she pointed to the final page and said, "This is the last step, Mom. Once you sign this, everything will be taken care of." And I looked down at the paper, at the space where my name was expected to appear, and for a brief second I imagined what would have happened if I had signed it that first day, how simple it would have been, how final. And I realized she still believed that moment was coming, that all of this had been leading to it, and I lifted my eyes back to hers, keeping my expression calm, thoughtful, the same way I had for days, and I said, I just want to make sure I am doing this right. And she smiled, relieved, confident again, as if we were finally reaching the end of something she had already decided, and in that moment I understood that she had no idea the end had already passed, that everything she was waiting for had already been handled, just not by her, and I let the silence sit there for a second longer before reaching for the folder, closing it gently instead of signing it, because I knew something she did not. And that knowledge was the only thing I needed. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I had in weeks, not because I could not sleep, but because I no longer felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me, and I moved through the house quietly, the same house that had felt unfamiliar just days ago, now steady again in a way that reminded me who I was before anyone tried to redefine it for me. And I made my coffee the way I always had, measured, routine, deliberate, letting the normalcy of it ground me while I thought through what needed to happen next, not emotionally, not impulsively, but step by step, the same way my husband used to approach every important decision. And I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of me, writing down each account, each document, each point of access that Robert and I had discussed, reviewing it not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to know it completely, without relying on anyone else to explain it to me again. And by the time Emily came downstairs, I had already finished my second cup of coffee and closed the notebook, sliding it out of sight just as she walked in with that same composed expression, that Same quiet confidence that had not changed, because as far as she knew, nothing had changed, and she asked me how I was feeling, her voice gentle, almost rehearsed, and I gave her the same answer I had given every morning since the funeral. I am taking it one day at a time, because that answer kept things simple, it kept her comfortable, and comfort was exactly what I needed her to feel, and she nodded, then reached for the folder again, placing it on the table between us like it belonged. There, like this was just another step in something already decided, and she said, "We should really wrap this up today, Mom. It will make everything easier going forward," and I looked at the folder, then back at her. Noticing how she did not ask if I was ready anymore, she told me it was time, and that shift, subtle as it was, confirmed everything I had already begun to understand, and instead of pushing back, I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands on the table the same way I had seen my husband do countless times before, and I said, "Before I sign anything, I want to make sure I know exactly where everything stands," keeping my tone calm, measured, not defensive, just clear, and for the first time, she hesitated, just for a second. Before answering, "Of course, that is what I have been trying to do for you," but there was something underneath her words now, something tighter, something less certain, and I watched her carefully as she began explaining again, pointing to sections, summarizing details, simplifying language in a way that made it sound harmless. But I was not listening the same way anymore. I was watching, noticing the parts she skipped over, the areas she moved through too quickly, the places where her explanation did not quite match what I already knew, and I let her finish without interrupting, without correcting her, because I did not need to, not yet, and when she finally leaned back and said, "Does that make sense?" I gave her a small nod, and said, "It does," because it did, just not in the way she thought, and then I reached for the folder, opening it slowly, turning to the final page again, letting the moment stretch just long enough for her to believe we were exactly where she wanted us to be, and I picked up the pen, holding it between my fingers the same way I had before, steady now, not uncertain, not hesitant, just controlled, and I let the silence settle between us. Because sometimes silence says more than any explanation ever could, and in that silence, I knew something she did not, something she had never even considered, and that was that everything she thought she was about to secure had already been secured, just not by her. And I lowered the pen back onto the table instead of the paper, closing the folder once more with a calm, deliberate motion, and I said, "I think I need one more day," watching closely as her expression shifted, just slightly, because this time, she could feel it too, something had changed, even if she did not yet understand what it was. That night, I did not sit in the living room with Emily like I had the nights before. I did not go over the same pages again or ask the same careful questions. Instead, I went back into my bedroom, closed the door quietly, and placed the folder on the bed beside me without opening it, because I no longer needed to read it again. I already knew what it was, and more importantly, I knew what it was not going to do, and I picked up my phone and called Robert once more. Not because I needed reassurance, but because it was time to move from preparation to execution, and when he answered, I did not hesitate this time. I said, "I want everything finalized," and there was a brief pause on the other end before he responded, calm and direct. "It already is, Margaret, but we can take one more step to make sure nothing can be challenged," and I listened carefully as he explained what that meant. Not complicated, just precise, confirming that every account had been updated, every authority had been documented, every possible entry point that someone else might try to use had already been closed, and then he added something that made me sit a little straighter. "If anyone attempts to act on your behalf now without your consent, it will not go through. And it will be documented," and I let that settle for a moment, because it meant something very simple. There was nothing left for Emily to take, nothing left for her to secure, nothing left for her to control, and when I hung up the phone, I felt a kind of quiet certainty that I had not felt in a long time, not even before my husband passed. Because this was different. This was not about trust, it was about clarity, and the next morning, everything looked the same kitchen, the same sunlight coming through the window, the same chair across from mine where Emily was already sitting with her coffee. But the atmosphere had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in a way that made every word, every pause, every glance feel more deliberate, and she did not waste time this time. She placed the folder on the table again and said, "We really need to finish this today," her voice firmer than before, less patient, and I could hear it now, the expectation underneath it, the assumption that this was the final step. And I sat down across from her, folding my hands together calmly, looking at her not as someone who was guiding me, but as someone who was waiting for something she no longer had access to, and I said, "Let us go through it one more time," keeping my tone even, controlled. And she exhaled slightly, nodding, opening the folder and moving directly to the last page, as if the rest no longer mattered, as if we had already agreed to everything else, and I watched her as she spoke, explaining, summarizing, pointing to the signature line again, and I noticed something new this time, something she could not fully hide, a trace of urgency that had not been there before, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she could feel the delay stretching too long. She could feel that something was not unfolding the way she had planned, and when she finished, she looked at me and said, "It is all ready, Mom," and I let a small pause settle between us before responding, not long, just enough to shift the moment, and then I said, quietly, "I know," because I did, just not in the way she meant, and I reached for the folder, closing it once again instead of signing it, and this time, I did not pretend I needed more time. I did not soften it, I simply rested my hand on top of it and said, "There is nothing left to handle," and for the first time, she did not immediately respond, because in that moment, something finally reached her, something she had not expected. Not a confrontation, not an argument, but a change she could not quite explain, and I held her gaze calmly, knowing that the part she had been waiting for was already over, and she had missed it entirely. Emily did not move right away after I said that. She just sat there with her hands resting on the edge of the table, her eyes searching my face like she was trying to find the version of me she had been speaking to for the past week, the one who nodded, the one who hesitated, the one who almost signed, and when she did speak, her voice was quieter, more careful. "What do you mean there is nothing left to handle?" And I did not rush to answer her, I let the question sit between us for a moment. Not to create tension, but because for the first time, the pace of this conversation belonged to me, and I reached for the folder again, opening it slowly, not to the last page this time, but to the middle, flipping through it as if I were reviewing something routine, something ordinary, and then I closed it gently and slid it back toward her, not with force, not with accusation, just with finality, and I said, "I mean that everything you were trying to take care of has already been taken care of," keeping my tone even, almost calm, and I watched as the meaning of that sentence began to settle, not all at once, but gradually, the way realization does when it was never expected, and she straightened slightly in her chair, her expression shifting in a way I had not seen before, less confident now, more uncertain, and she said, "Mom, I do not understand. We have not signed anything yet," and I nodded once, because she was right about that part, and I said, "No, we have not." And then I added, "And we are not going to," and that was the moment everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift in control that could not be undone, and she leaned forward. Slightly, her voice tightening just enough to reveal what she was trying to keep hidden. "Why would you say that? This is for your protection, for your accounts, for your future," and I listened to her carefully, because I had heard those same words before. Just arranged differently, just softened, and I let her finish before responding, because I was not arguing with her, I was stating something she could not change, and I said, "I spoke with Robert," and that name landed differently, I could see it in her eyes, the way her focus sharpened, the way her posture shifted, because now this was no longer a conversation she could guide, and I continued, steady and clear. "He reviewed everything, and we have already updated what needed to be updated." And I paused just long enough for her to understand what that meant before adding, "Every account, every authorization, everything, and the silence that followed was not confusion anymore. It was realization, and she sat back slowly. Processing, recalculating, trying to understand how something she had been managing so carefully had moved beyond her without her noticing, and she asked, "When did you do that?" Her voice quieter now, not as controlled, and I answered honestly, "Before you asked me to sign anything," because that was the truth, and it mattered, and for the first time since this began, she did not have an immediate response, no explanation, no reassurance, no next step to offer, because there was nothing left for her to direct, and I rested my hands calmly on the table, looking at her not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity, and I said, "You told me you would handle it, and I believed you, so I made sure it was handled." And I let that sit there, not as a challenge, not as a victory, but as a fact she could not rewrite, and in that moment, everything she had been waiting for was no longer hers to reach, because I had already moved past it. I did not raise my voice after that. I did not push the moment any further than it needed to go, because everything that mattered had already been said, and I could see it in Emily's face, not anger, not even disbelief, but something quieter, something harder to name. The realization that whatever she had expected from me was no longer available, and she looked down at the folder in front of her, then back at me, as if she was trying to find a way to move the conversation back to where it had been, to regain the ground she thought she had, and she said, "You should have told me," her voice softer now, almost defensive, and I listened to that, really listened, because for a long time I would have taken that as something else, as concern, as care. But now I heard it clearly for what it was, an expectation that I should have included her in a decision that was never hers to make, and I shook my head gently, not to dismiss her, but to correct something that had been quietly shifting between us for longer than I had realized, and I said, "There was nothing to tell, Emily. Everything I needed to decide was mine to decide," and I kept my tone steady, not sharp, not accusing, just certain, because certainty does not need volume, and she looked at me for a moment longer, searching for something to argue with, something to challenge, but there was nothing there, no confusion left, no hesitation she could step into. And the silence that followed was different from the others we had shared over the past week. This one was not waiting for a decision, it was settling after one, and she leaned back in her chair slowly, her hands folding together in front of her as if she was trying to gather her thoughts, and I could see the shift. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real, the understanding that this was not a situation she could manage anymore, and I reached for the folder one last time, closing it completely and setting it aside, not because it mattered anymore, but because it no longer belonged at the center of the conversation, and I stood up from the table, not abruptly, just calmly, the same way I had done 1,000 times before for ordinary moments, because this was not a scene, it was a conclusion. And I said, "I am going to keep things the way your father and I built them, the way we agreed they should be," and I let that statement stand on its own, without explanation, without apology, because it did not need either, and as I walked toward the hallway, I paused just briefly, not to turn back, but to add one last thing, the part that had taken me the longest to understand, and I said, "I thought trusting you meant stepping aside. But it does not, it means knowing when not to," and then I continued walking, leaving the kitchen exactly as it was, the sunlight still coming through the window, the coffee still sitting on the table, everything outwardly unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone, and later that afternoon, when the house was quiet again and I sat alone in the same chair I had been sitting in all week, I did not feel defeated. I did not feel like I had won anything either. What I felt was something steadier than that, something clearer, and as I looked around the room, at the walls that held decades of memories, at the life that had been built piece by piece over time, I realized I had not protected it. By fighting, I had protected it by refusing to give it away, and for the first time since all of this began, I understood that I had not lost control when my husband passed. I had simply forgotten that it was still mine, and now that I remembered, I was not going to let anyone take